Thank you, choir. Some of you are probably aware that I am the son of a retired Hallmark Cards executive. And so, holidays like Mother's Day were rather fraught and complicated. And let me tell you why that is. It's because everyone in my family were experts on greeting cards. And if you were to make the faux pas of sharing a non-Hallmark card with a loved one on Mother's Day or Christmas or any other day, well, that was, nothing was said about it. But the inference was that you obviously did not care to send the very best. Back when I was a college student in the late 70s and early 80s, you know how college students are. You go off to college and you get a little bit of knowledge and you are deceived into thinking that you actually know something. And I can remember coming home at the end of the semester, I think this was my junior year, and it was Mother's Day. And we were having dinner and they were asking me, well, how did your semester go? And they inquired about the various classes I had been taking. One of the classes I had taken at KU was on American religious history. And I sort of blurted out in the middle of dinner, well, I learned something really interesting about Mother's Day that you might be interested in knowing. Did you know that the two women that sort of got Mother's Day on the map in the late 19th century were, well, they were Christians, but they were also socialists. And they were also pacifists and feminists. And in fact, Anna Jarvis, who was the one who finally got Mother's Day passed into law under President Wilson, she was so put off by the commercialization of Mother's Day that ensued that she spent the rest of her life trying to get it rescinded. My father was not happy with this news. Hallmark has also been involved over the years with television films. There's a Hallmark channel, Hallmark network on cable, and they were developed mainly to be able to show commercials about greeting cards. And you know what they're all about. They're gauzy and dreamy, and they sort of portray this kind of idealistic notion. The one that gets everybody, they show it every year at Christmas. It's about the middle-aged student who comes back to the teacher's classroom when they're about to retire and puts the card on the table, and it's just so wonderful about how much this person, the impact that this person had on life. It's kind of leave it to Beaver Land. Well, when I was a kid growing up in Overland Park, Kansas in the 60s and 70s, we actually sometimes called Overland Park Leave It to Beaver Land because of its seeming serenity and peacefulness. But that has changed as our society has changed. A new practice has become evident. At a high school reunion last fall, a childhood friend told me, she lives near the elementary school that we attended. She told me that children in that neighborhood no longer walk alone to our old neighborhood elementary school. She said that every morning a parade of mothers and fathers accompany their children the short distance to school, dogs in tow, cell phones in hand. It looks like the practice of safety, but it's also the practice of fear. You just never know. It could happen anywhere. It could happen here, I think people think. And of course it did happen there about a month ago at the Jewish Community Center, just a couple of miles from the schools that I attended. These parents know about something that we call school incidents. They know the statistics about the number of American children that are shot and stabbed and killed in our schools each year. And like the rest of us, they know about the big ones, from Columbine to Newtown to Chicago to Pittsburgh, and they know there are so many more stories that never make it to CNN. The soundtrack for the story of childhood in America reverberates with gunfire and the sobs of stunned classmates and grieving parents. It is, in a sense, the soundtrack of fear. Fear is our newest neighbor, even in sunny suburbs that we today might call Leave It to Beaverland. Well, this is important to understand, I think, because in John's story about the Good Shepherd this morning, fear is also a familiar neighbor. You see, John's community lived with the reality of persecution and the threat of extinction. Their first century Mediterranean world was a very scary place. The persecutions were heating up, and the followers of Jesus were, in the eyes of Rome, just so many lambs for the slaughter. The Jesus movement at this time was still very new. It was struggling to define itself against the threat of Rome and the threat of competing philosophies and counterclaims to truth. And so they told stories, meeting under cover of darkness, hidden from the authorities, huddled in some secret spot, listening for the sound of Roman boots. They told stories to counter the fear. They told stories that helped them to name who they were and to whom they belonged and whom they could trust. They heard the story of the shepherd and the sheep, and they remembered who they were. The metaphor of sheep and shepherd made sense to John's community. You see, in ancient Palestine, shepherds brought the sheep of the village into a common sheepfold for the night. In the morning, in order to take their sheep out to the fields for grazing, each shepherd had to separate his sheep from the common flock. Each sheep had a name, and each shepherd had a particular way of calling his sheep, so each sheep would respond only to its own shepherd. Even if another shepherd called the sheep by its own name, it would not respond. It was the knowing that counted. Well, John's community also knew about good shepherds and bad shepherds. The thieves of the story who taxed the poor into poverty, the ones who starved the people and fed themselves, the ones who traded the shalom of their tradition for the Pax Romana. No doubt they longed for a good shepherd. John's telling the Jesus story. They hear that Jesus is the good shepherd, the way of comfort and sustenance and abundance and strength, even in the face of death. Now, I can imagine that sometimes their fear got the best of them, and they got more concerned about the identity of the stranger than their own identity. So sometimes John's gospel sounds jarringly exclusive, in puzzling contrast to Jesus' loving voice of inclusive welcome. But the story of the shepherd helped them to remember a better way. They knew about the way of the good shepherd, and that was the way of love and not fear. And they became the people of the good shepherd. In fact, early Christians began to scratch the image of the good shepherd, a lamb slung over his shoulders, on things like catacomb walls. They painted frescoes into baptismal fonts to mark the beginning of life, and they carved the good shepherd into tombs to mark the end. That's because they had a sense that they belonged to the good shepherd from beginning to end. So good shepherd was more than just words, more than an idea. It was their way of life. In a sense, it was their brand. This brand of the good shepherd told them who they followed, who they were, and more than that, how to live. They were to live the good shepherd way. And they knew that they belonged, but it didn't stop there. The way of the good shepherd was the way of the wide embrace and the long reach. Just as one of them had found a safe spot on the inside of their tight circle of belonging, so they were to include the one at the far edge. Just as they had been given hope in dark and violent times, so they were to encourage one another. Just as they were held close in the comfort of the loving shepherd, so too were they to reach out. And they became known, those followers of Jesus, for their generosity, for the way that they cared for the very least and the lost, and for the common good, as we see in our reading from Acts 2 this morning. They became known for their love. They became the beloved community. So ask yourself, isn't that how we want to be known as well today? Isn't that what our churches must be today in our climate of fear? The beloved community, practicing not the exclusion of the stranger, but the hard work of love. The opposite of fear, after all, is love. You know, hearing about the present-day parents in my childhood neighborhood and reading the latest school incident headline, I want all of us to think about what it means to do the hard work of love. I'm not talking about sweet sentiment, but rather the heavy lifting of the Good Shepherd that we see in our text this morning. Of course, I'm not a shepherd, so I don't know how to describe the heavy lifting specifically. Of course, I could quote scripture about love casting out fear, but I think the best way I know how to describe the work of love on this day, Mother's Day, is to talk about that love in terms of mothering. You see, I believe that what we need in our churches and in our schools and in our homes and in our public squares is a kind of love that looks something like a mother's love. The kind of love I'm talking about is tender and yet it's fierce. It means naming danger when it threatens and meeting it with savvy and courage. It means paying attention, knowing what time it is and what the weather's like out there. It means teaching the difference between right and wrong. It means being responsible for our words and our actions, and calling on others like public officials who block common sense gun laws to take responsibility for their actions. It means showing up and being present, caring, not expecting somebody else to handle it. It means having a strong sense of identity and belonging, coupled with a profound respect and appreciation for others. It means compassion, knowing that we are all in this together. And of course it means getting your heart broken, which opens you to hold the pain as well as the beauty of being fully human. The practice of love might change the soundtrack of fear in our society. One person who lived out this tender yet fierce kind of love was Julia Ward Howe. She's perhaps little known today except as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, that first hymn we sang this morning. But she was a really famous person in the 19th century. She was famous for being a poet, an essayist, a lecturer, a reformer, a biographer, and God forbid, a Unitarian. She worked to end slavery, helped to initiate the women's movement in many states. She organized for international peace, all at a time, she noted, and these are her words, when to do so was a thankless office involving public ridicule and private avoidance. She'd seen such vile and vicious deaths during the Civil War, and she had heard the soldiers singing the heavy words of a popular song at that time, which was called John Brown's Body. Remember him? She had seen families ripped apart and broken, and her heart, full of compassion, she yearned for a way to make things better. And so with the power of her words and the encouragement from her friends, and with the echoing of this tune of John Brown's Body in her mind, she sat down to write new lyrics. And in February of 1862, magazine, The Atlantic, published the Battle Hymn of the Republic, paying her $5 for her efforts. The tune gradually caught on until it swept the North, became one of the great hymns of the 19th century. Then in the 1870s, during another war, the Franco-Prussian War, Julia felt the cruel and unnecessary character of the contest. She called it a return to barbarism, the issue having been one which might easily have been settled without bloodshed. And so she began a one-woman peace crusade that began with an impassioned appeal to womanhood, to rise against war. She translated her proclamation, it's called a woman's proclamation, into several languages. She distributed it widely. 1872, she went to London to promote an international women's peace congress, but she wasn't unfortunately able to bring it off. So back in Boston, she initiated something else. This time she called it a Mother's Peace Day observance on the second Sunday of June, and she held a meeting for that for a number of years. This was kind of the nascent beginning of what eventually became Mother's Day. Her idea spread, but was later replaced by what we today know as the Mother's Day holiday, which is now celebrated in May. The woman who really got this over the goal line was named Anna Jarvis. She was a Methodist, and as I said earlier, she wasn't too happy with how things turned out. In order to spread the word about Mother's Day, Julia Ward Howe wrote a piece called The Mother's Day Proclamation, and these are her words. She said, "From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence indicate possession." Granted, Howe's writing about the vicissitudes of war, but isn't the gun violence that we experience in this country a kind of ongoing, undeclared war? Whether it takes place in Newtown, Connecticut, or the streets of the south side of Chicago, or someplace closer to home. As our opening hymn this morning, which is, by the way, an updating of Julia Ward Howe's hymn, as it stated this morning, "Arise, all mighty women of the earth, and join with me. Summon all your sons and daughters from their fears to be set free. When no mother's child goes forth to war, we'll know true victory. Christ's peace shall reign on earth." A worthy sentiment on this, the 100th anniversary of Mother's Day. Let us pray. Well, Lord our God, it's easy for us as Americans not only to forget our history, but not even to know it. We are a forward-looking people. We're more interested oftentimes in what's going to happen next as opposed to where we've been. But help us to know that others who have gone before us have experienced many of the same issues that we have, and that we can learn from them in terms of their response, how we ought to go about living our lives today. For this, we give thanks not only for the mothers who hold up a bright light for us, but those female leaders who continue to shine a light forward for us today. We ask you to